Hey, so welcome back to another episode of the Soulful Side of Life with me, Portee, and today on the podcast is Austin Akers. I've known Austin for about 2-3 years ago now, and he's talented in quite a few areas. The overall industry is communications. And he's got his hands in quite a few pots at the moment. And the pot that I interviewed him for today is on being an international election observer. And you might be wondering, what is that? Think election poll watcher, but doing it in another country. Basically, international election observers make sure that elections being done in other countries is accurate and correct, and that there's no funny business going on, to make sure that the democratic process of voting and putting in leaders is being done accurately. And this is one of the pots that Austin has his hands in at the moment. So I thought it would be cool to have him on to talk about the specifics of what this kind of role does and why it's important in the world. But just a little bit about Austin. Austin is a communication strategist and trainer with a background in international development, democratic resilience, and public affairs. Over the past decade, he's worked with NGOs and election observers, think tanks, and advocacy groups to shape messaging and experts and lead high-impact communications efforts across complex political environments. In addition, it won't come off in the interview, but Austin has this wicked sense of humor. He's so funny, and that brings light to a room, especially, in DC, the world that Austin comes from, where it can be quite serious. It's nice to have a personality like his in the room to lighten the load. So enjoy this podcast interview with Austin Akers. I hope that you find it inspiring. I sure did, and I think it's a pretty good interview.
Austin, hi. Thank you for joining the podcast.
Hi, Allie. Thanks for having me.
So for those who may not know you, you are kind of like a jack of all trades in the sense that you've lived abroad, you have taught English in Spain, you have traveled to other countries, and you worked full time in the international development space doing like democracy building, but now you have a communications agency that you've started, and you do election observations, which is the theme of today's conversation. So I would like to ask you, how would you describe what election observation is to a kindergartner?
Well, to a kindergartner, I think you have to start with a little bit of a civics course on democracy and elections themselves. But essentially, election observation from an international perspective is building legitimacy for a given election by bringing in international actors to be flies on the wall and meet stakeholders throughout a country or throughout a region to understand what the election environment is like, and provide that information to international actors, domestic audiences following the election to see primarily if, things like the playing field is free, is it a fair election? And you don't want to be overly involved while you're there. It's not your role to change anything or to drive anything in a different way. You're just eyes and ears. We've seen how democracy needs as much legitimacy in elections in particular to build through the domestic audience, or it could be quite fragile afterwards.
How is an international election observer different from a poll watcher for you on election day in the U.S.?
So it's similar. Most of the places I've been for election observation, there are domestic observers there as well. Typically, political parties that have enough either seats in parliament or have candidates in certain races, they'll be allowed to have an observer or two at certain polling stations. There would also be domestic NGO groups, usually, that would have domestic observers. And then you have the large international groups that would send international observers. Oftentimes, It's the OSCE out of Vienna, and a few out of DC. There are various other organizations that participate, but you do have all of those sort of poll watcher type of people through different organizations or through the parties themselves when you go to a polling station.
I see. Why? Okay, when did the US start getting involved in election observations? Was it during Reagan's
Yeah, I was going to
administration?
say at least the 80s,
Yeah.
maybe before. The Carter Center participates, the National Democratic Institute participates, the International Republican Institute participates. A lot of those are usually through federal grants, and those reports are brought back to legislators here in the United States. But my guess would be sometime in the mid 80s.
Okay, and that was the aim of the US foreign policy. Why? I mean, it's got to benefit the US in some way to focus on this.
Yeah, if you go back, you can find particularly speeches from Reagan, as you said, and he was a huge advocate for promoting democracy internationally, particularly with the United States' history and our Constitution. But he saw that other foreign actors, bad actors, were out promoting their systems of government. And if the United States didn't participate in advocating for our system of government, the Western world's system of government, we weren't sort of participating in that battle of ideas. And we needed to go out and be advocates for that. Election observation is a bit more of a stability exercise within that. We're not going to a certain country that doesn't have a particularly stable democratic system and advocating for them to change in any way. We are simply the eyes and ears of what we're seeing while we're there. Recommendations and becoming an advocate, those can come afterwards given what we see, but we don't do that while we're there.
God, I imagine this was Reagan's way of kind of pushing back against the Iron Curtain, maybe in some way.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think at the time, communism was a huge threat.
Yeah, and just yeah, trying to advocate for the American way of things. So what's a typical day like for you when in what countries have you done election observation in
I
and what's
most
a day
recently
like?
came back from Albania. Before
Wow.
that, I was in Georgia for 3.5 months, which was a long-term mission versus a short-term mission. A short-term mission is typically about a week or 10 days, and it varies. So you could be an election analyst where you're given a certain topic and you're covering a whole country, or you could be observing in a specific region across different topics. A day would include setting up meetings, and you do this all on your own, usually with a partner that you've been assigned to, that you go to meetings, whether it's with NGO activists in the area, election administrators, government officials, political party candidates. You would go to political rallies and you would ask questions about the election code, how their preparations are going, sort of characteristics of what they're going through as participants in that democratic process at any given moment through election day and a little bit afterwards. So it varies. There's different components of an election calendar as well. Many countries have a designated period that the elections are going to be happening, 30 days, 45 days before election day. So you would have different types of meetings for the pre-campaign environment, then the campaigning environment, then election day itself, which is sort of game day. And you go out and you hit as many polling stations as possible, talk to the administrators, talk to voters about their experience, and just gather as much information as you can.
I see. Wow, like I remember when I finished my studies in London and I needed a job. And so I had known about IRI in DC and I went back to DC, but I didn't know what IRI really did. And by starting to intern with the Women's Democracy Network, it gave me this idea about what democratization building is, but getting to meet like another component is these organizations bring over parliamentarians to the US for these trips, week-long trips where they meet congressmen and they get to see DC and have all these kinds of trainings, which is like another component of, I know it's not election observation, but it is a training that kind of, yeah, it trains the parliamentarians seeing a hands-on week of what it's like to do government work.
It's a broad portfolio, generally. A lot of the work those implementing NGOs are doing, and it varies based on funding streams and government priorities. A lot of it is geared towards educating our own members of Congress and executive branch employees who may not have eyes on the ground, whether it's for an election, whether it's for a women's rights project, whether it's for technology and democracy, whether it's any sort of government grant that we're working on at any given time. I do think we take for granted sometimes as Americans the skills it takes and the constant preparation that democracy takes, and accepting that there is, big power competition happening that we are participating in. The metaphor I give a lot of people for some of the work we do is it's not necessarily the engine that gets your boat from A to B. It's not your specialty. It's not your technical skill that is unique and that is powering your boat. But there are going to be holes in the boat. There's going to be things poking through, disinformation, misinformation, and our little communications ecosystem that has put us all in these little bubbles that you have to go and fill those holes in your boat with participation, advocacy, educating yourself. And I think that's a lot of the work that these implementing organizations have done and election observation does, is it fills those holes to make sure your engine is getting you from A to B.
Does part of your work require when congressmen who go on these election observation trips, like looking after them, or you haven't had to deal
It
with
depends on the organization. The first thing that comes to mind is the EU Commission or the European Parliament. They send higher level stakeholders like that, and if you are a participant from those countries in their election observation missions, you might deal with that. From the United States side, I haven't seen too much of that directly with members of Congress. I do think it benefits to keep a little bit of space between the implementing organization and an actual government official so that our work can be perceived as authentic and non-biased. Those moments will come afterwards. I know a lot of the information is given during hearings to educate those members of Congress. Now, each group will, conduct their short-term observation groups differently. So you might have various levels of stakeholders or just more people interested in observation. When I was in Albania, it was youth-focused with a group called Agora Election Observation. And so everybody was 25 to 35, and we were solely focused on youth and youth participation in the elections there. So a lot of us were people trying to get more experience. Any of those ages, a lot of post-grads. I'm on the higher end of that spectrum, which is scary, but nevertheless, you get a variety of different people that are interested in this kind of work.
So it is a sought after job in a lot of these countries.
Yeah, there are different structural pieces to it, right? If you want to be an election observer for the OSCE, and you are from Germany, say they have a little bit a different process of getting selected through their participation in OSCE than other participating states. The United States has a little bit different because they select people from their own country. So a lot of the German colleagues I had in Albania, they needed some experience before they could participate in some of the higher level selection process. So each country that's participating sets their own rules there and has different sort of structures of getting involved. The implementing NGOs from the US side have different structures than the NATO parliamentary group that goes versus domestic observers if you want to be an observer in your own country. So it varies, which is probably a good thing.
Yeah. Do you ever worry about, like, I remember when I was at IRI and it was the whole Egypt situation, and the office there got closed, and it was a lot of stress at that time. Do you ever worry that whatever country you're in, the government could come and close down things or
Not in
lock you up?
particular. Every context is different no matter what your job is when you travel abroad and work somewhere. I've done this work for IRI, but I've done it outside of IRI since I haven't worked there directly for a year and a half. And the truth is, everywhere I've been, the people that are receiving you, the governments of the countries that you're going to know that you're coming. You get certified, you have certification, and that gives you legitimacy. Any official business that you're going into, any meeting, any polling station. In fact, it's been the opposite. I think the places that you would maybe guess could be hostile, they're actually some of the most hospitable. Now, whether it's authentic or not sometimes is in question. But I've never felt in danger. I've always felt like I've had support structures for the organizations that I'm working for in case something does go wrong, security protocols, etc. But nothing really has happened. I think some of the most dangerous stuff is the amount of people who invite you to their home for a home-cooked meal with homemade drinks or wine and finding your way home if you've had too much.
Yeah.
But
But
no,
it,
everybody's been very friendly. Now, you want to be cautious in some of the types of conversations and being conscious of who you're talking to in certain ways, as you would expect, a foreigner coming to the United States and starting to talk to us about deep-seated policy disagreements or something. And some of that's just common sense, though, in my opinion.
gotcha. It sounds like it's a cultural experience as well, that you get to go into people's homes, which it's not all work. You get something out of it too.
Absolutely. I'm passionate about the work, but the experiences I've taken alongside of the work every time I've done it have been amazing. The people I've gotten to work with and the people I've gotten to interact with have been awesome. And you get to go to some parts of countries that you might not go to as a tourist. And I think that's a gift. You get to see not only a different country and how people live in a different culture, you get to see different variations of that within itself.
That's awesome. A few last questions. If for somebody that's wanting to, in the US, perhaps look into a career like this, say like it's a high schooler or college student listening to this, how do you go about doing this kind of work?
I would start with volunteering. Something that any of these organizations are going to look for is experience. And then once you're volunteering, using the people that you meet along the way. It didn't take me too long to figure out that I was passionate about this and interested in this kind of work. And so maintaining the relationships of the people I worked alongside, making sure I was honest and upfront about wanting to do more and putting the work in. So it's like any other project path. You've got to climb a ladder of some sorts, but I've found people to be accommodating. It's not a huge, network of people interested in this kind of work, particularly the further along you get. You have to remember some of this includes moving around the world for months at a time and dropping whatever you're doing wherever your home is. And so that's, a lot of people who have small children might not be able to give that sort of time commitment. It's a subset of people as it is. And so once you can get into the networks and work alongside people, it should work as long as you're passionate about it.
For those who have families, like say it's a trip during the summertime, are they allowed to take their families with them for 2, 3 months if it's a long?
It wouldn't be paid for, right? A lot of
Right.
this stuff comes from government grants or private foundations that are, allocating money, not for a family, but for a person. Now, I guess your family could go along and, some organizations you're finding your own accommodation, giving a stipend, and they're not necessarily all going to find your accommodation for you. So if that's something your family was interested in, and I guess it wouldn't be
A
too
problem.
difficult.
Gotcha. I know that DC is in a war at the moment and divided. I'm not asking you specifically about Trump's cuts of international aid, but has that affected the election observation world?
Definitely. It definitely has. So I think, across DC, I lived there for 6 years. There's a lot of turbulence no matter what specialization you're working in within the federal government. Now, for our sort of work, yeah, and there's been a bit of a reset that's kind of happening. American strategic interests have been put to the forefront, and if the administration right now is finding that whatever you're doing doesn't actually advance American strategic interests, or there's a redundancy in who's doing it, yeah, you're going to be sort of in the firing line of some of these cuts. Now, I think I mentioned to you earlier, every crisis breeds an opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
Reform is a scary thing, particularly in DC, but it can be a beneficial thing. I am a strong advocate for the, work that we do on the world stage. It absolutely advances American strategic interests. Soft power plays a very important role, particularly when you're starting to look at what China's doing in debt trap work around the world. We're seeing what Russia's doing in Ukraine. There's a lot that's uncertain in foreign policy around the world, and we need as many tools in our toolkit to participate in that.
Does this administration think that election observation is important?
That's a good question. I think the administration probably less than the Congress. I think when you start looking at House Foreign Affairs Committee, Senate Foreign Relations Committees, the information that election observation brings to them is really helpful. And what they understand in a very beneficial way, and this would be America's strategic interest, as long as we are willing to admit that we are going to participate on the world stage, and we are a world power that already is, that when you don't do this type of work, states, countries, they can have turbulence, authoritarianism, and that is hampered by poor not having election observations. And that sort of is a slippery slope that leads itself into more costly U.S. foreign interests later on. That's a real, I think, the best argument for making sure that election observers are participating as much as possible and getting as much information as they can. And as the executive branch wants to negotiate on things like trade deals, on things that seem to be very important to them, these are components to them. I certainly don't think it should be the determinative piece of any negotiation, but for us not to be advocates of our own system, understanding that the consequences can be more costly in the future is a mistake I don't think we should be willing to make.
Gotcha. Last question. A main part of the podcast is, character, the kind of character that you need to sustain the calling that you're in. To do election observation, what kind of character is needed to do this job and do it with ethics and do it well?
I think part of you has to be able to put yourself in the shoes of the people that you're meeting in the country that you're working in, right? I think it's some sort of akin to empathy, but having that sort of awareness, because a lot of times I say I've never met a stranger, you're enjoying yourself, you're being treated like kings and queens as guests in some places. You're meeting really interesting people, you're hearing about their problems, but at the end of the day, you have to understand that you're leaving in a month or in 2 weeks or, at some period of time. And if you don't have that sort of empathetic mindset and you start to cross boundaries, then people aren't going to give you good information. And I think the best election observers are the people who make people feel comfortable to give them information on their experience, in the same way that any friend, family member, tourist you meet in the United States asking you questions about your experience in your home country. You want to feel comfortable in that interaction, and that's going to lead to more information.
For sure. Actually, a question came to mind. So this is my last question. It's just a fun question, I feel. Does OSEC, do I have that right?
OSCE, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe.
That one, or any other election observation organizations that aren't American, do they come to the U.S. when we're having elections? Oh, yeah. They do, and they observe.
Absolutely. Wow. They sent 100 international
that.
observers to the United States for our elections in November.
And what do they do, though? Like, where do they go to the polls?
Yeah, they go to the polls, they go to events. I am not sure, which would be interesting to know, whether they put, because I know it was 100 international observers from the OSCE. I don't know if it was 2 in each state or if they centralized them in sort of the battleground states. I imagine with their methodology, and typically the Europeans are very stringent on staying on their methodology, that they would probably have done 2 in each state, which I would be really interested to hear from the 2 who came to my home state, Kentucky, or some of the other ones. But yes, they came, they're doing the same thing, going to campaign events, talking to voters, observing election day processes, talking to administrators. and coming up with the same reports. And I think that's important. We have to, understand that elections democracy, it is not something that is perfected and kept. Once you get it there, you're constantly going to have to maintain improvements and observations. So it builds our own credibility when we allow people to come and observe our elections the same way the Europeans allow us to observe theirs.
And do those reports go to Congress or to the president or?
For the OSCE, it was published online. I think I read it. I would hesitate to start characterizing it without looking it over again, but I'm sure the report made it through certain levels of the U.S. government. There typically are recommendations attached to any election observation report that's coming out afterwards, so they probably have recommendations. In my experience, perhaps the parties aren't listening too closely.
I see.
But no, yeah, they're here.
Wow, I never thought about that. But
Mm-hmm.
how arrogant for me to think that Americans don't need election
Mm-hmm.
observation. We do, because I've heard just even in my county when I go to party meetings and they ask for people to be poll watchers because sometimes one side or the side you're on are doing illegal things. So yeah, we need it too.
And most often you don't see too many shenanigans going on. I mean, I think when people hear about it, it's often like you're some sort of election police officer that's going around and finding all these dirty tricks being used. And most of the time, 95% of the time, it's people who are, passionate about volunteering, doing a good job, making sure people feel welcome and comfortable, decent processes. You see some stuff along the way. Maybe somebody passes out 2 ballots to a voter, but you certainly might not think it's intentional, or
Mm,
that, one extra vote that they
yeah.
passed out was some sort of big scheme. However, you do get as much information as you can so that when all observers from your mission give that information, it creates more of a mosaic, a picture that people can see. So yeah, no, you're received very welcomely.
That's awesome. Well, Austin, thank you so much for your time and for joining the podcast.
It was good to see you, Allie, as always.
You too, you too. I hope that you enjoyed this podcast episode and that you have found a soulful connection to the conversation. God bless you, and until the next episode, go bless somebody else.